Well, welcome to the webinar. We're still about a minute and a half early, so we'll just give it folks another 2.5, 3 minutes or so to log in. We'll get started just about 2 o'clock, 2:01. Thank you all for joining us today. We'll go ahead and get started with our NTMA and PMA One Voice Trade webinar. Thanks for all for joining us. Good afternoon. My name is Omar Nashashibi with the Franklin Partnership, the One Voice lobbying firm in Washington, D.C. I'm joined today by my colleague at Franklin Partnership, John Guzik, and also Paul Nathanson of the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell. Today's go-to webinar session is being recorded for archiving, so all participants are in listen-only mode at this time. However, you do have the ability and are strongly encouraged to ask questions at any time by submitting a question on the right. You'll see a box over there. What we'll try to do is obviously we will answer all questions at the end, but if you do provide something right now, we're more than happy to answer those questions as we roll through the program this morning. All attendees will also be receiving a copy of this webinar afterwards, so feel free to share that with your colleagues at your shops after. And you'll have our contact information at the end of the slides. You can also reach out to us if you have any direct, confidential, or off-the-record questions that you would like us to address as well. This morning, we'll go ahead and give you a quick introduction. I'll turn it over to John to introduce our shop, and Paul to introduce his.
This is John Guzik. I work with Omar at the Franklin Partnership. We have the honor of, excuse me, I'm fighting a cold and I'm getting my voice back, but we are PMA's and NTMA's bipartisan government relations lobbying firm here in Washington. It's been an honor to represent middle market manufacturing for a number of years. In addition to representing manufacturing trade associations, we represent folks in the defense industry, healthcare, hospitals, and cities.
And this is Paul Nathanson. I'm with Bracewell, the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell, PRG. PRG is the Strategic Communications and Lobbying arm of Bracewell. I do strategic communications for PMA and NTMA here in Washington, work very closely with John and Omar. We've been working with both PMA and NTMA for over a decade, and we represent a variety of manufacturing, energy, and other clients. We also are managing the Coalition of American Metal Manufacturing and Users, which is a coalition that was formed a couple of months ago with the support of NTMA and PMA and other trade associations to address the steel and aluminum 232 tariffs, and we'll talk about that more in a little bit.
And for today's agenda, as we know, not everyone is interested in everything. We did want to cover a little bit on NAFTA 2.0 talks, the latest there. We'll begin with that. We'll switch over a little bit to talk about the latest with China and some of the 301 intellectual property tariffs that are coming into effect possibly in a couple of weeks, and then obviously on the autos, but then the big one. So around the 2:30 time or so, we'll get to the steel and aluminum tariffs for those that are of primary interest and focus on that. As of right now, we are definitely in the trade wars. The retaliations are beginning. The announcements of which industries are going to be hit. Mexico just released their retaliation list about an hour ago or so. So, folks, we are full speed ahead on the trade wars as of right now. John, I know your voice is in and out, but a quick thought on NAFTA and where we are?
Yeah, we're often asked, what is the president's goal on all of these trade discussions? And his big picture, long-term goal is he wants there's a trade deficit in this country. He wants balanced trade. That is his ultimate goal. And so, as you look at the renegotiation of NAFTA for the first time in 23 years, yes, 23 years is a long time, and there are modifications that could take place in NAFTA that make sense. The financial services sector, there wasn't the online banking and services that take place today. But there's a number of other issues that are directly impacting manufacturing that the administration has drawn a line in the sand on. I mean, one of the issues that they're looking at is increasing rules of origin. This is an issue that you're gonna hear a lot about. For those of you who are auto manufacturers who have American-made cars, that you will see on the inside of your car that 62.5% of your car was made in a NAFTA country. The administration wants to increase that to 75%. That is almost a line in the sand that the administration is doing. But in the discussions and in the negotiations with Canada and Mexico, he has added additional provisions that he would like to see, for example, including 75% content of auto parts for some of the core components to also come from the NAFTA countries. For lesser, how would you call them, Omar, lesser technologically advanced products, he has lower percentages that he's interested in seeing in this content.
And so what we're seeing here, I think, if you take away nothing else from this entire presentation, please remember what John just said. The president is really focused on trade imbalances. He literally wants to balance the trade deficit. And so we no longer have $357 billion a year with China or any other deficits with Mexico, even though we are running a steel surplus with Canada at this time. And so putting that in mind is how do we, one, decrease the amount of imports coming into the U.S., and at the same time increase the exports going out. That is the driving principle behind the president. Please keep in mind that it is definitely the goal of this president. This is his policy. This is his baby. There are two other staffers surrounding him, but the president is committed to tariffs. We heard about 3 hours ago that the president is potentially directing his staff now to negotiate separately with Canada and Mexico, not withdrawing from NAFTA, but going at it a little differently than we have thus far. As John pointed out, you've got a couple of the requirements that the U.S. is floating out there on the top of the screen. What they're trying to do is they're basically boxing in Mexico from 4 different spaces when it comes to automotive areas. John mentioned there's going to be another number of rules of origin content requirements, both for light trucks and also for automotive or passenger vehicles, rather. In addition to that, notice that the $16 an hour, what that is they want certain amount of parts, to John's point earlier, to come from certain nations that are paying a prevailing wage, $16 an hour or more. They didn't come by that number by accident. It's intended to mess with Democrats, honestly, a little bit, who have been driving force behind the $15 an hour minimum wage. And so that's where that comes from, trying to draw in and force Democrats a little bit more to the table, and at the same time applying additional pressure. As we all know, Mexico does need to begin increasing their payments as much as they can. Where we are currently on the timeline of this, and we don't like to speak in definitive terms, but I think John might agree that NAFTA for this year, in terms of a new NAFTA being passed into law, is not going to happen. The reason being, under the existing law, the president, once he actually signs a new NAFTA, which he's nowhere close to doing, but once he signs it, it gives Congress a 6-month cooling off period to review it. So that means even if he were to sign this literally today, the soonest that Congress could actually vote on it would be December 5th. And so that puts us in the lame duck Congress. As of right now, not expecting us to have a final NAFTA sent to Capitol Hill this week, or signed rather. We at this point do not believe that a new NAFTA will be voted on and ratified in 2018. It might be up to if the Democrats take over the House. We'll see what the prospects look like in 2019 in terms of timing there as well.
And Omar brings up a very important point, is the NAFTA agreement that the trade representative Bob Lighthizer is negotiating is assuming there's a Republican Congress and a Republican Senate. And if these negotiations do not get wrapped up soon, and I agree with Omar, it's very unlikely that they're going to get an agreement in principle done quickly so that it can be voted on in the lame duck portion of Congress, and that's in after the election in November and December before the new Congress gets sworn in. That then means a new, potentially a Democrat-controlled Congress will be voting on a NAFTA bill. Now, what a Democrat-controlled Congress will vote on a trade bill is going to be very different than a Republican-controlled Congress. The Democrats have been pushing for stronger labor and environmental standards in Mexico as part of NAFTA. Those are two provisions that, for the most part, except for the $16 an hour provision that Omar pointed out, hasn't been a real focus. There's been other issues that have been the focus of the trade representative's office. And so if they come to an agreement, depending on when it is, and if it is under Democrat Congress, it may have to be a very different NAFTA agreement than we're looking at right now.
It does, and there's a good point in terms of a question just raised. How are we determining these actual balances? How do we achieve these goals? So especially in business, you want to know, okay, what's my mission? What's my end game? And how the goalposts continuously being moved. Right now, in terms of what determines a trade balance, at least when we understand in the eyes of the president, would be just a literal one-for-one, dollar-for-dollar, come in and come out. The way the current trade balance is measured is not by goods, but by value of goods. So it wouldn't be X amount of parts coming in versus going out. It's rather the total dollar amount. And it factors in a number of things, everything including aircraft. So when Boeing sells 20 airplanes to a foreign country, that artificially inflates our exports, whereas it's not done year over year, unless you do it fully year over year and exclude oil, gas, and aircraft. So that's a lot of how they do it. But honestly, this trade balance issue has been a priority of the president's well back into the 80s. So this is not necessarily something new. And bringing back over to NAFTA in terms of the timeline and picking up on some of John's points of where do we go from here? Obviously, we've got the Mexican presidential election on July 1st. The candidate is abbreviated, we call him AMLO. He looks like he's going to win up by 22 points right now. We describe him as a combination of Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. Figure that for a second. So he's very, very far left progressive, but he's extremely nationalistic and protectionist. So that could be the person we're potentially negotiating with on NAFTA. Now, while he does not take office officially till December 1st, we are already seeing some hiccups on the Mexican negotiation side there as well. And those of you should have seen last Thursday, Trudeau of Canada came out very forcefully against the U.S. and was on Meet the Press on Saturday, Sunday rather, bewildered about how Canada is now being treated as a national security threat. So where do we go from here? We do still think that there will be some kind of a new NAFTA 2.0 that does come into effect possibly next year. We're not hopeful right now. Things typically have to die several times in Washington before they come to fruition. But if it does come together next, we do definitely see some updated technical points in terms of ease of access across the border, moving goods more efficiently through electronic means, also in terms of financial and insurance abilities. So we don't see a whole lot of major changes on the items that have been discussed thus far. The three top lines for the president. One, to John's point on the balance of trade. Two, the rules of origin. And then three, the president is insisting on some kind of sunset or automatic termination potentially after 5 years on NAFTA. And that is a non-starter for both Mexico and Canada. So as of right now, we're not hopeful on any much more progress happening in the next few weeks on NAFTA at least.
The problem with the sunset review, the five-year review, and when you first hear it, say, hey, it makes sense if an agreement that we come together with Canada and Mexico doesn't seem like it's working. Hey, let's reject it or let's re-examine it after 5 years. The problem is, as you all know as business people, is you make decisions 5-10 years down the road. And you're not going to invest in Canada and Mexico and our other trading partners if there's a potential that you may lose your investment after 5 years if the Congress, not knowing what the political affiliation is going to be, may change. The presidency may change. And so this 5-year sunset review, while it may sound good to some people, it really is a disincentive for manufacturers to continue to work with Canada and Mexico, as trading partners.
Washington just gave us certainty with the new tax cuts, and they took it away with the trade issues. I think, as Paul will tell you right here we're looking on the China situation. There's going to be a lot of numbers you hear. We talk about steel, which is a 232 tariffs You remember George W. Bush, he did 201 steel tariffs. Right here in front of you are the 301 tariff on Chinese imports, and that deals with intellectual property, forced technology transfers, and other violations the U.S. is accusing the Chinese of. But Paul, this one's gotten a good amount of attention, especially since they're the world's two largest economies.
Thanks, Omar. Yes, the 301 is a section of the U.S. trade law that, in this case, deals with intellectual property violations. And the way that this 301 investigation came out was that in August of last year, the president was going to announce steel was interested in, well, I think many people on this call will remember when it was reported he said, "Bring me tariffs, I want tariffs." And the rumor was that he was going to announce the steel and aluminum tariffs that we'll talk about in a moment that were eventually announced a couple months ago, that they were going to be announced last summer. Some of his trade advisors who are no longer there, or some of his economic advisors said, we don't think you should do steel and aluminum tariffs. Instead, you should do a 301 investigation targeting China, and it would target intellectual property violations by China. And I think, as many of the manufacturers know, that this is a real problem that we have with the Chinese, and it's a continuous problem. So they announced last August, I think it was, that they would undergo this, they would launch this 301 investigation. The results came in the last, I think it was 2 months ago, Omar, if I'm not mistaken, and they announced that yes, China is violating intellectual property rights, and they made a list of 1,300 Chinese products worth $50 billion that would be subject to 25% tariffs. There is a whole, unlike the Section 232 steel tariffs and aluminum tariffs that we'll talk about there, it's a different process with the 301 tariffs. A list of products is published, and then there is a comment period, and they have a day of hearings. Well, it's been seesawing back and forth between the it looked like they were close to a deal. The president tweeted that it had to do with the Chinese phone company, and he indicated that they weren't going to do tariffs and that they were going to come to some agreement. But then it was announced that yes, they are going to go forward with the tariffs. The Chinese announced retaliation, and then they sent Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross this past week over to China to negotiate on this and other issues. Those negotiations reportedly did not go well, and now we're facing tariffs. The Chinese are facing tariffs that would take effect around June 15th, and China. I'm sorry.
The announcement would be
yeah.
take effect.
The announcement. Sorry, my colleague Josh is here. The announcement would be on June 15th, and again, the Chinese have released a list of their retaliation as well. We've included on the slide a sampling of the list is wide ranging, but this is just a brief sample of some of the items that would be hit. So this, I know many of our members, in addition to finding that they are facing higher aluminum and or steel prices and also longer delivery times, are also looking at the 301 tariff list, the list that the U.S. put out, and perhaps the list that China put out, and seeing that they're being hit again. So this is another, and again, the 301s are China specific. It only impacts U.S.-China trade.
But Omar, don't the 301s also impact specifically NTMA and tool and die makers?
Yeah, it does. It does hit a good amount, and also a good amount of metal stampers as well. It does specifically hit die stamping machines, for example. It does hit a number of other areas in machinery. If you'll take a look, this is just a sample, and this is a preliminary list. We expect to get the more finished one, as Paul mentioned, on July 15th. But there's a lot of machines that our members use, and what we can do for folks like Leslie and a few others that are email or asking questions now is we'll send you the full list. The best way to go about this, and we just went through this exercise for somebody yesterday, is you need to identify what we call your HTS code. That's the Harmonized Tariff Schedule. Every single product manufactured in this entire planet has an HTS code. So you'll see how these descriptions are written in there. Shearing machines includes presses, so on and so forth. That number on the left is the HTS code. So whether we're talking about the steel and aluminum tariffs or the Chinese tariff or retaliation against U.S. exports, in order to identify whether you are affected, you need to have your HTS code. If you are already an importer or exporter, you will already have that because it's readily available on any customs information. So go talk to somebody in your purchasing shop. They have that. These are universal. These are global codes, and that is how everything will be determined. And so when you look at some of the dies, not so much the dies included, it's more machines. You've got some plungers in there, for example, other parts, specific parts of a press. So we will email this list out if you'd like, in addition with the webinar or presentation rather that goes out. But the challenge that we've come in with folks when they've asked us for advice is they give us a description of an item, but often the description in the real world, as you can imagine, does not necessarily match up with what the government has out there. So what we'll do, just so that way we have the information for everybody here, we'll get you, make sure you have that initial link. Note that the one we will send you is from a couple months ago, as Paul mentioned, and we will make sure that the final list that is put out by June 15th is also circulated as well, because we have spoken to a number of people offline and confidentially, because they are importing a good amount of machines and other kind of equipment and tools coming from China at this point. Now, there's a question just now about where does all the money go from the tariffs? As of right now, the money is going into the General Treasury. I'm sure you're all glad to hear that Uncle Sam is getting the cash. So anything that is collected, whether it's a 232 steel, aluminum, the automotive slide that we're about to jump to, China or otherwise, that all goes into the U.S. Treasury, and you can trust your elected officials to spend your money wisely. What used to happen in the past, that money used to go to the actual steel companies that filed cases. We lobbied for years to get that changed. We have even asked them, if you're going to collect these tariffs, at least throw them into apprenticeship grant programs. But no, as of right now, the money is going to the General Treasury. Lastly, on the China, before we jump over to Autos, go ahead, Joe.
Well, I was going to say, the one problem with it going to the Treasury is, you know, many of our manufacturers have benefited from the tax reform, and quite candidly, it was a big the tax reform bill really increased the budget deficit. And the thought is that through economic growth, that the budget deficit that was projected by the Congressional Budget Office would be smaller in the end. But when you then throw on these tariffs, the proponents of the tariffs would say, well, it's going to offset some of the losses from tax reform. Well, if you increase the revenue going into the government because of these tariffs, it's going to offset the economic benefit from tax reform. And so there's a true economic discussion taking place in Washington of what is, you know, where should we be spending our money? Should it be on the tariff, you know, on the stick side, or is it on the carrot approach of using taxes as an economic growth tool?
Yeah, and there's a lot. We go back to the fees that they used to put in the 80s that Reagan did instead of calling them taxes. So there's other ways around it. Right now, what we're looking at on the China, the latest, there's definitely a back and forth that is not going well. Wilbur Ross's trip on Saturday and Sunday this past weekend to China did not result in a whole lot of progress. Our understanding is the Chinese offered about $70 to $75 billion worth of concessions, meaning additional purchase of U.S. goods, everything from natural gas to pork, to soy, and a number of other items as well. The administration rejected that. Trump was still focused on, he had 375 in his head, and the number is actually 357 billion is what I believe the trade deficit currently is, annualized with China. So the U.S. has said, no, we're not there on the $70 billion in terms of additional purchases from the United States. So it does not seem like we are close. There is a real concern that June 15th is next week about. So we are just, you know, not very far away from that deadline that appears to be rapidly approaching. 25% would be the tariff on the first tranche that comes out. We'll get that list June 15th. On June 30th, we'll get a number of other listings of other export control items that will be restricted from China. So keep in mind, this is going to go back and forth. We don't see a good outcome. The U.S. wants to eliminate the tariffs, eliminate the trade deficit, but also push China to the table a little bit more on Korea, which they don't seem to be wanting to do. But John, do you want to talk a little? You're a Michigan guy, so good. You want to talk about autos for a little bit to keep us on schedule? Since you're our Michigan guy, so national security, automotive, that might make sense to you, but there's national security.
Right. So the president and his administration is struggling with getting a deal on NAFTA, and they're struggling to get an agreement with China on the 301 tariffs. And one thing I was going to mention is this is where the trade war discussion comes in, because the president says we're going to put $50 billion in tariffs on Chinese goods, and China says we're going to put $50 billion. So the president, responded, okay, I'm going to do $100 billion. Well, he hasn't given us a list of that $100 billion. But even if we did come up with another list of $100 billion, China, the tit for tat is going to lead to a trade war, which is not beneficial to anybody. And so, because of the frustration with NAFTA and the 301 and the president's love for tariffs, he has said, well, I'm going to use the specific section of the trade law to restrict imports of automobiles and auto parts because of national security concerns. And so that's what the president recently did. His goal is to limit imports of automobiles coming into this country. Statistically, 48% of all automobiles imported into this, 48% of automobiles sold in this country are imported. The real news, though, is that a majority of those vehicles are coming from Canada and Mexico. His goal is to go after the Mercedes-Benz and the BMWs, the German and Volkswagen automobile manufacturers. But in the end, GM, Volkswagen, BMW, Mercedes, and other German auto manufacturers import less than 500,000 vehicles, 500,000 units a year. And so it's sort of a struggle for those in the automobile industry to see where he's going with this.
Yeah, and that's one of those questions that we've got is who asked for this? And then we'll talk about that in a minute. I'll give you an overview on where we are on the 232 tariffs in a second here. But the automotive industry didn't ask for it. The automotive parts industry didn't ask for it. We know NTMA nor PMA asked for it. A lot of this comes from, there was a meeting that we arranged last summer with Roy Hardy from PMA and Dave Tilstone and NTMA and a couple of our members as well, that went in there, and Wilbur Ross, the Secretary of Commerce at the time, told the group that we will take care of downstreams, quote. We've heard that continuously now in the past 10 months or so, that we have a plan to take care of downstreams. But is this their plan to take care of downstreams? We're not sure. As we said, there are some real concerns here, even on behalf of the auto parts folks, as right now, most people that we talk to are busier than they have been in years that are automotive suppliers. In addition, our associations aren't limited to automotive. So now we say, hey, what about me? We all stand up and put our hand up and say, you can't, now we're just going to end up causing more of a challenge for non-automotives if you're protecting one segment of downstream steel users and aluminum users, but not the entire economy. One example that we tend to talk about, especially in the face of that comment Wilbur Ross made last summer, was many of our members will say, well, why don't you just go ahead and apply a tariff on the steel or aluminum that's used that would cover a automotive part or the part of a washing machine or a lawnmower? The answer comes from the hard data that we've seen right now. Washing machines currently have a tariff that were recently imposed upon them. The price of washing machines is going to increase between 8 and 20% this year, including for domestically, wholly manufactured domestic washing machines here in the U.S. will also increase 8 to 20%. So in the end, we're going to increasingly make these products that our end consumers need unaffordable at a time where there's no way that the wages increases are keeping up commensurate with those price increases. So that's one of the key arguments that many in Washington have made. We don't believe the answer to solving our trade imbalances are blanket tariffs on our trade allies. To John's point, you take a look, is Canada a national security threat? How much is Japan? How much is Korea, Germany, for example? There clearly are problems with China. That is the universal accepted fact in Washington, D.C. Our message has been really to focus on that right now. Where we go from here on the automotive tariffs before we switch over to steel and aluminum, as we said, they just formally launched this on last Thursday. I believe it was formally announced that they're going to do the 232 National Security Review. So the testament here that they have to do are the imports of the automotive parts and those vehicles. Are they a substantial risk and a threat to impair national security? So right now, where they've identified, there's still going to be an issue. I'll get to the question on, is this dealing with heavy duty trucks versus others? Right now, it's covering vans, SUVs, light trucks, and cars. The question we don't have clarified, and we spoke to the motor equipment manufacturers in OESA today, and they're seeking clarification too, is about the parts. You can have automotive parts that can go into a light truck, but can also go into something over 10,000 pounds. So when does that transition? Are they going to differentiate between parts that go into heavy duty versus passenger, or is it going to be blanket? That is still unclear. Right now, the next steps, as we mentioned, they just launched this investigation formally. Technically, this has to be completed within 270 days. We hear it's under expedited measures. There's going to be public hearings about 6 weeks from now, and public comments are due in about 2.5 weeks from now.
But Omar and I both have privately raised the question: did the president make this announcement calling for these 232s on autos and auto parts as a way to leverage the NAFTA negotiations? And in the end, knowing that it may take 90 to 180 days to get this 232 on autos, completed, is this just a way to bring Canada and Mexico back to the negotiating tables? Because right now, the ministers, the trade ministers are not in Washington. They're not negotiating. They've got the Mexican presidential election taking place on July 1. Is this just a way to leverage these talks on NAFTA? We don't know the answer to that question, but we are moving forward with the understanding and the assumption that this administration will move forward on some 232 on autos and auto parts.
Yeah, from a strategic standpoint, this comment is not a criticism, but actually more of a compliment. This president will manufacture a crisis to leverage. And if you take a look at trade, that narrative fits wholly within everything he's done on those previous two slides we talked about on China, on NAFTA to John's, on autos. There's also the perception of winning that weighs very, very strongly here. On the China, for example, the did a 180 about based on this a week and a half ago is because the press said he was getting killed by the Chinese and losing to them in the trade negotiations because he wanted to save 80,000 Chinese mobile phone manufacturing jobs. So a lot of this is the narrative, but he is trying to exert maximum pressure upon our folks out there. And yes, I mean, John brought this up earlier, talking about carrots versus sticks. We haven't seen a whole lot of the carrots approach. The administration does believe that you have to walk in there proving that if they call your bluff, you're willing to do something. So again, that's kind of more of a compliment in terms of a direct negotiation. But I think the challenge is with the administration not understanding they're not negotiating over buildings and companies, but over other voters and other countries. So those politicians are increasingly being put and backed into a position through the stick approach where it's tough for them to back down. We saw that with Mexico. Basically, Trump's enabled AMLO to now move forward where the more moderate candidate could have had a chance months ago, or a year and a half ago rather. And the same thing's happening, being emboldened over in Europe and elsewhere over there. But so to that point, Paul, let's just get right into it on steel and aluminum. We were just talking right now on the 232 investigation, which is national security for autos. Want to give us a little background on how we started last April of 2017 and where we are right now in steel aluminum?
Sure. The White House, the Trump administration self-initiated a Section 232 investigations on steel and aluminum pretty close together within a couple weeks of each other. And as we have just discussed, a 232 investigation is a national security investigation, with the question being, do imports of steel and aluminum threaten national security? The administration has used a broad definition of national security to mean economic security. The Commerce Department did a study very long story short, after several postponements in announcing what they were going to do, the White House announced tariffs of 25% on steel and 10% on aluminum. Those tariffs were announced in early March to take effect March 23rd. This would be all steel and all aluminum. However, the president temporarily excluded several of our major trading partners from the tariff back at the time, including Canada, Mexico, and the EU, and a few other countries, to give more time for negotiations. The tariffs went into effect, as I said, at midnight on March 23rd for those other countries, including Japan. As I don't have to tell folks here that the impact, as we've seen so far, was higher steel prices, much higher steel prices, and longer lead times, with the U.S. becoming an island of high steel and aluminum prices, and difficulties in getting deliveries. Unfortunately, the news didn't get any better for those who are concerned about access and pricing of steel and aluminum, as the temporary country exclusions for the EU and Canada and Mexico expired at the end of May, and the administration did not renew them, so that the 25% tariff on steel and 10% tariff on aluminum applies to all to steel and aluminum imports from these countries as well. The only exempted countries, well, South Korea has agreed to a quota of 70% of the shipments, and there is agreement supposedly with Australia, Argentina, and Brazil. Again, though, it's unclear what Australia agreed to, but for the others, that you had to agree to a quota if you wanted to get out of the tariffs. This has led to our trading partners publishing a list of retaliation on U.S. export. Not surprisingly, we have everything from agricultural goods to Harley-Davidson motorcycles, which seem to always get hit with retaliation since I've been doing this for about 20 years. Poor Harley-Davidson, because it's a well-known U.S. brand. They also happen to be headquartered in a state that is a battleground state, Wisconsin, and our trading partners do follow the political map as well. So right now we have these tariffs. There really is no timeline on how long these tariffs could last. The stated purpose of these tariffs for steel is to bring the capacity utilization for domestic steel mills up to 80%. Right now it's at 73%. And for aluminum to get it up to 80%, right now it's at 48%. For those of you who are old enough and have been in the business a while and remember the 201 tariffs, that's when President George W. Bush in 2002 enacted 30% tariffs for 3 years, and they were rescinded 18 months into them. And in fact, we have a study that we've seen that showed that capacity utilization actually went down as a result of the 201. So to get to that 80% is going to be very difficult. So where that leaves us now is there is the tariffs on both steel and aluminum. There are more and more industries now getting involved in advocating for their removal because of the retaliation list that came out. The agricultural community is very upset. And I think probably some of the folks on the phone have filed for product exclusions, which you can do through the Commerce Department through a website. There's been over 10,000 product exclusions that have supposedly been sent to the Commerce Department. There's about 8,000 that have been posted on their website. There has been no exclusions granted as of yet. The first ones that went in at the beginning of April, the Commerce Department had promised that they would be acted upon within 90 days. So we're looking at the end of June to see if they were going to act on them. But the Commerce Department had predicted no more than 4,500 product exclusions to be filed. The reports coming out of the Commerce Department is not hopeful, given that they're on Indeed.com and LinkedIn Jobs advertising for jobs to review these product exclusions. So right now we're in. Right now we are, and we'll talk about this in a second. We are going to be discussing these. We are formed a coalition so that we can explain what the impact of these tariffs are on domestic manufacturing. And we are right now. Several of the folks I think on this phone have been highlighted in the media about the impact of these tariffs.
And before I turn it over to John to talk about NAFTA and in Europe, before we switch the slide, I did want to come back to the South Korea thing at the bottom there. There are going to be several different tiers, and John will touch on this when we get to Europe and NAFTA on the next slide. But right now, you've got three scenarios. You can have a tariff applied to you, which is 25% steel, 10% aluminum. That's in effect on the entire world right now, with the exception of South Korea, Argentina, Australia, Brazil. And keep in mind also on further discussions that that's one area, the tariffs. The next one is a tariff rate quota. So once you hit a certain level of imports, then a tariff will take effect. What you're seeing at the bottom of this slide, though, is a hard quota. South Korea has a hard quota. Every Monday, Customs and Border Protection will be posting on its website the amount of steel, as you can see by kilograms, that has been imported from South Korea into the United States. Once you hit that number, so products of tool steel and other products that are provided under that first heading, as I'm reading out loud to you, that quota is already filled. You will not be allowed to bring in any more of that product from South Korea into the United States. You can have all the money in the world. It will not make a difference. You will not be paying a 25% tariff. Customs will either reject it at the port, it will go into a bonded secure warehouse until it can be cleared in the next year or the next quarter, depending on which country we're dealing with, or it will be destroyed. So we talked to one company last Thursday who can literally, there's no other manufacturer in the world but a South Korea firm. Thankfully, they have not hit their quota yet, but we've told them start buying and find a place to store the stuff. So please keep in mind the hard quotas versus tariff rate quotas, because potentially, as now we'll jump over to John in Europe, Europe might end up getting some kind of a hybrid, or potentially, if they get a deal, they might get a quota then plus tariff. But keep in mind, South Korea is a hard quota. John?
To Omar and Paul's point, let me just make this more dramatic. All steel and aluminum imports from across the world has a 25% steel tariff and a 10% aluminum tariff, except steel coming in from South Korea, Australia, Argentina, and Brazil. So all steel from across the world. I mean, and this is troubling. So now, as Omar and Paul pointed out, that Canada, Mexico, and the EU had a country exemption. That country exemption expired at the end of May, and Mexico and Canada got their exemption, their country exemption, because they were still negotiating the NAFTA agreement. Well, NAFTA negotiations, as we talked about, fell off the wheel. I mean, the wheels fell off the buggy on the NAFTA negotiations. The EU was in discussions with the Trump administration on a European trade agreement. Those fell by the wayside. The EU was trying to persuade the administration, unlike South Korea, unlike Brazil, unlike Argentina, where there's a 70% quota or tariff rate quota, the EU was looking at a 100% quota. So we won't import more than 100% of what we're doing right now over a 3-year period. And the administration has rejected that. So as a result, Canada, Mexico, and the EU have chosen to retaliate against the United States. Interestingly, is the EU is putting a 25% tariff, a similar size tariff, on 182 products coming into this country. U.S. is a net steel, and I think it's steel, and Omar, you can correct me, steel and aluminum exporter, net exporter, or is it just steel to Canada? And so we're making money on steel exports to Canada. That's why the United Steelworkers Union, which were all in favor of the 232 on steel and aluminum tariffs on the United States, impacting the United States, came out and against the administration as they put forth, as they added the tariffs onto Canada, because they realized it's going to impact the steel workers who are part of the union here in the United States. It impacts them as well.
So let's
what
talk
is
about
the
next
outlook?
steps and where we are.
Yeah, I was going to say, what is the outlook moving forward? You know, we're already seeing, as Omar has pointed out, higher prices for your steel and aluminum purchases, whether you purchase domestically or internationally, longer lead times. We have seen during the 201 steel tariffs, there are a loss of 200,000 manufacturing jobs. These 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum, we're protecting the 156,000 domestic steel workers in this country. There are 6.5 million steel consuming jobs. Your employees who are making, bending, grinding, and grinding the steel that goes into other parts in this country. So this administration is protecting 156,000 steel working jobs versus 6.5 million manufacturing jobs. Where this ends up, it's uncertain at this point. In the end, you know, right now the administration feels emboldened. Jobless rate is down. Things are going well. Confidence in the economy is well. Presidential approval rating is up. Is that there's no negative vibes out there to convince the administration that perhaps these policies may be short-sighted. It'll be a matter of time. We have continued to work with members of Congress to appeal to the administration to say, look, don't use these broad-based penalties against the world. Let's go after the bad actors. Let's go after China. We know China is dumping some steel into this country and using transshipments, making steel, sending it to other countries, and then shipping it along to Canada, Mexico, and the United States. Let's go after the problem countries. Let's not attack the world on this. We've been successful in getting. Go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. So the next steps to John's exact point there, and finish up the slide. We'll jump to the next one, and we're going to get to Paul talk about advocacy here as we get close to wrapping up. Where we see this, our crystal ball, and there's a saying, "He who lives by the crystal ball eats broken glass." But what we think is on the NAFTA side, what's happening there, that is fully interconnected. What he's doing on steel and aluminum for Canada and Mexico are most likely tied directly to the future of NAFTA negotiations. And so we don't see a whole lot of change in progress on the 232 there until we get additional progress on the NAFTA front. Separately, from the European Union standpoint and where that might stand, that has about 4 different areas of moving parts that are all interwoven. Because again, we don't clearly view the Europeans as a major national security threat. Rather, we're trying to force their hand and them to the table on reducing automotive imports from Germany, getting their help and pushing them to the table on Iran, getting them to stop doing a pipeline deal with the Russians and the Iranians. So the president is using the steel and aluminum specifically on the European Union for broader geopolitical issues, and the NAFTA steel is more directly to that trade pact specifically. The question remains, what is the end game? Is it to create more jobs? A steel lobbyist who we know very, very well and personally like a lot, she told us these tariffs will go away when we hit 80% capacity utilization rate. So they're not looking at a specific other job or other factor number as we get in there. Quickly back, just following up as we wrap up on the steel side here to Paul's points. Here are some of the latest statistics there for countries. You're asking, okay, what do I do? What do I tell my customer? Hopefully you have a good relationship with your customers and maybe you can pass on 100% of the tariffs to them or at least work something out. In the event you cannot, there is an avenue to, as Paul mentioned, to request an exclusion for your product. And knowing that, as Paul mentioned, 10,000 just about have been filed, 0 have been granted, though probably could see some granted around the Independence Day week coming up here around July 2nd, we think is the earliest date we could see them. One thing we wanted to point out, as having lobbied on this issue now for 15 years, all 3 of us have, look at what Nucor did. Nucor filed an objection to an American company who was requesting an exclusion request for a steel product they can't get in the U.S. Nucor's response, they objected and they admitted that they don't have a history of making this product, that they don't really intend on making this product, but they objected to the American manufacturer's request purely on the basis of what they say technicalities of an incomplete request. So you can see what we're dealing with right now. Paul's shop, they've got some intel and they've picked up, we've confirmed that part of the reason why there's no rush to grant many of the exclusion requests, frankly, is because the higher ups haven't given any direction on what constitutes an acceptable request or not. And so we aren't holding our breath in many cases for a lot of these exclusion requests that come through. However, it is a situation where if you don't file, forever hold your peace. So those of you that would like to talk to us offline, or the folks over at Bracewell have been great resources to both our associations, and they can help guide you through that process. Lastly, on this point, carry forward. And the product exclusion request does not carry forward other people beyond the company that requested it. So for example, let's say one person on this call, Mark, and his company is granting an exclusion request for a product. Leslie has to use the exact same steel, aluminum, it doesn't matter. Her company has to separately go and request something right away for themselves. So it is not a it is specific that exclusion request, if it's approved, would only be granted to the company itself requesting it. So those of you that use service centers, also keep that in mind. Many of you have been in touch with your service centers asking them to request on your behalf. But this is a very, very complicated process. We don't have a lot of hope for it, and that's why Paul and his shop at Bracewell helped us and took the lead on founding the coalition, so we have a voice. So PMA and NTMA members have an avenue in Washington, D.C., Paul.
It's very timely with the latest question that came in regarding are there any efforts to publicize the negative employment impact of the steel tariffs? The answer is yes. As I mentioned, both PMA and NTMA are founders of the Coalition of American Metal Manufacturers and Users. The website is tariffsourtaxes.org, and the purpose of the coalition is to bring these stories out and to coordinate efforts to get these tariffs rescinded and terminated as quickly as possible. As I indicated, the negative part of these 232 tariffs, there's no end date. They can go on for a very long time. The positive part is the president can decide tomorrow that this is not the way to help manufacturing and that they should be terminated. So our goal is to bring your voices out to show what the negative impacts of these tariffs are doing to U.S. manufacturers. And so we are doing a strategic communications campaign with media relations, social media. We have been in all the major media, ranging from Wall Street Journal to Fox to CNN. We continue to get requests every day. NTMA and PMA are not alone in this effort. We have everybody from the NAFTA to the fasteners, to the precision parts folks, all these trade associations. Today, the Hands-On Science Partnership, which are companies that create science and educational kits, are very concerned about the cost of aluminum and steel. They have joined our coalition, so it is growing. Where we need your help is we need folks who want to tell their story about the possible impact of these tariffs on your businesses, or the impact that the prices have already had, or the longer lead times have had. We need your help. We'll connect you with members of the media who are very interested in learning more about this. Our message really isn't a battle with the president. We point out that the president has been very good for manufacturing overall with the tax cuts and with regulatory reform, but that these tariffs alone can really undo all the positive things that those other policies have done for manufacturing. So please visit tariffsourtaxes.org. Contact NTMA or PMA to see how you can get involved. We'll never send a reporter your way without your permission first. We'll contact you before we send anybody your way. We could really use your help. I do believe that we are already making progress as far as educating folks. A study came out today that shows that the latest with the EU, Mexico, and Canada included, and the retaliation lists that have been published by these countries, that there is going to be a net loss of 400,000 jobs in the manufacturing sector as a result of these tariffs, and so we'll be obviously trying to educate folks on that as well. So while it looks pretty bleak now, we do believe that if we continue to have a strong advocacy campaign, we can get the tariffs terminated.
I know. I was like, what are you doing?
So the background noise you all are hearing right now is we just unmuted everybody's line. So as we're wrapping up here, we will open it up for questions here for a few minutes. So those of you that are participating by phone, if you could put your phone on mute if you don't have a question to ask. But feel free to keep typing questions in the box on the right, or go ahead and just up, and we'll go ahead and answer your questions here in the next 3 or 4 minutes as we're wrapping up. We do definitely encourage you, this is an election year, please invite people into your for tours. They need to see what you do and understand the impact this is having. Yes, Donald, this does affect forgings that are coming in from Mexico are currently affected by the tariffs, as are aluminum castings, and so those are hit there as well. Advocacy standpoint, this is 100% executive branch. Congress would have to pass a law, the president would sign, that would then reverse these, and that is highly unlikely. There are some efforts to look at a court case, but we are in the process of just working to try to convince the president to reverse himself and accept this and move on. With that, we're just going to
Omar?
questions.
He's like, no, I'm going to do this.
Omar?
Go ahead.
It was also interesting.
Hi, this is Jeff Nelson, R&M Manufacturing. Hey, has anybody done a study yet of how many estimated plant closures could happen because of these tariffs?
What we did today is we took a look at the census data, and from when George W. Bush put the 201 steel tariffs in effect, and that, as Paul pointed out, did actually exclude Canada and Mexico when W did it. During that time, we lost about 15% of our tool and die shops and just under 20% of our stamping shops during that time. Now, some were reclassified, some needed to close for other reasons, but generally, yes, this is going to increase, to John's point, the price of manufacturing for those 6.5 million steel consuming jobs out there. And we're also looking to update some of the other studies that we've done previously on this as well. And we're trying to get that information in front of the president.
Okay, thank you.
Agriculture too for China, I think. But. Yeah. So he said we're not going after.
Any other questions with the line open?
The question is why, or their president to say, look, go back to not going after the whole wide world. Just going after it, but nobody's talking about. They talked about a little bit about the committee that was consulting the president is no longer on the committee consulting the president. Different people. That's what they said.
Like I told you, I was at the PMA. Nucor was definitely involved with the president,
right? For
sure. These are all the steel mill people at one time, So.
But then, they said what happened. I don't know where you caught in, but they said it's interesting is that there's going on and working in steel with this tax or whatever on behalf of 65,000 or
160,000 steel workers, not the
versus
$6 million
manufacturers.
Which is, there's some truth to that. I will tell you though, we haven't had a customer push back for us on price yet.
Where we are, as we're wrapping up, folks. But to that point, the question is, as the president has been so strongly supportive of manufacturing in the past, how is he viewing this helpful and broad? From the steel standpoint, the president basically has equated steel manufacturing with all manufacturing. And that's been what Paul's message has really been, that we've got these 6.5 million steel using jobs far outweigh those that are in the producing jobs. But as what we said at the very early onset, that the president's theories and on trade were shaped in the 1980s. And so in many ways, he's still trying to push through a lot of those arguments that he supported back then. And so right now it's to create an environment for the president to feel that he can claim a victory.
The tariffs to the customer we roll in are labor rates, so we do the same shit. Yeah, I know. We go, we weren't going to raise it this, but no, we got to do this. We might as well put it all together and get it all. We kind of, everybody's done the same thing. Pricing hasn't changed for a couple of years now, all the way around, and so now everyone's rolling it all together.
For those of you in that conference room, we're listening to your conversation.
It's the same shit. We're using the steel prices to get our new labor rates in there.
Right, right. Well, but we have to keep a sustaining profit, and we can't absorb all the losses first before we start making.
Okay, well, thanks. If there are any other questions that you all have, feel free to shoot us a note. We're happy to answer anything. Contact your local NTMA or PMA folks or national in Ohio. Thank you very much for taking the time today. As we mentioned, this webinar is being recorded, and we will also make sure you have the PowerPoints. We will circulate that along with the 301 tariff list, and you can get a little better sense of some of the other format and questions in there. This is a very, very fluid situation. As John and I talk every day, it changes every minute. So please stay in touch with us. We're happy to provide some off-the-record confidential information to you as you need. Thank you again for taking the time today, and have a good afternoon.